In saying this, and I would not even try to attempt to predict if we are going to be at the end of 2008 at this point, I would only conclude by saying that as we speak, there is a gathering storm over the skies of southern Israel and Gaza, you can call it. And there is a major attempt underway right now to basically test the possibility of making this progress, and it deals with the two problems which Tony Blair already indicated. Security for the Israelis and decent living conditions for the Palestinians. And this has to do with the fact that the Israelis, since the pullout from Gaza, have been subjected to barrages of missiles, which are bringing the situation in the southern part of Israel very quickly to a point which cannot be further tolerated by a government which has an obligation to defend its own citizens. And we are moving in this circle, probably for the next few days, few weeks, and I will end up by quoting what once Prime Minister Rabin used to say, which was a paraphrase on a very famous dictum by another Israeli historical leader, Mr. Ben-Gurion. So I start maybe with Ben-Gurion, because Ben-Gurion said in 1939-1940, when the British mandate imposed restrictions on the free immigration to Palestine at the time when the Jews in Europe were persecuted and on the eve of the Holocaust and the outbreak of the Second World War, Ben-Gurion said, we will fight the White Book, which was the book of restrictions instituted by the British mandate. We will fight against the White Book as if there is no Second World War, and will be fighting alongside the Brits against the Nazis as if there is no White Book. Rabin paraphrased this in the 90s when he was Prime Minister, and he was challenged after Oslo by acts of terrorism, saying that we are going to deal with the terrorism as if there is no peace process, and we are going to deal with the peace process and there is no terrorism. This is more or less what the current government of Israel is trying to do today, which has been more or less paraphrased by Foreign Minister Livni a week ago, in saying to her interlocutor, the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Ahmed Karia Abu Allah, he said, listen, I shall be in this room even if yesterday or the day after tomorrow a missile is going to hit Sderot and hurt many Israelis. I shall come into the room. And I expect you to be in the room when we are going to retaliate against those perpetrators of terrorism. So it's an attempt underway. How this is going to develop, as you know, not everything can be predicted, clearly not by the ambassadors. Thank you. So if there are questions, I should be delighted.
Yes, please, stand.
Thank you so much for your comments, Mr. Ambassador. I have to confess, for many years my watchword professionally has been to know nothing about the Middle East, so my question may come from a tremendous position of ignorance. But I was struck by how often this discussion about the peace process is discussed very much as, I mean, clearly the parties are Palestinians and Israel. But I wonder if you can comment a little bit. I'm always struck at how much this conversation excludes the overarching international environment of the Middle East. I wonder if you can comment a little bit on, you talked about the change, the rise of extremisms in the Arab world. I wonder if you might comment on whether it matters at all, the rise and fall of feelings of pan-Arab sentiment, vice nationalisms within the Arab context, and whether this plays at all, particularly now that we think about having essentially two parties on the Palestinian side. Does it matter that Palestinians feel more Arab with their brothers maybe in 2003 with the invasion by the United States in Iraq? I mean, it seemed that there was a lot of pan-Arab sentiment, and as that maybe is receding, as more people begin to think of themselves as Saudis or Egyptians and Palestinians in this context, does this help or hurt the promotion for peace?
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. Of course, we are reflecting a great deal on that, and I will just refer you to one of the basic assumptions underlying the Israeli-Arab conflict resolution process. It was made possible with the collapse of Pan-Arabism. As long as Arabism, Pan-Arabism was in place, you know, and the best example was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the former, the late president of Egypt, who in his struggle against imperialism, Zionism, and Israel, was the quintessential figure of Pan-Arabism. And after his death, the Pan-Arabism and all the versions of Arab socialism collapsed. And the result is that finally Egyptians under Sadat basically put one major question on the table and said how long we are going to sacrifice for the sake of this notion called Pan-Arabism. It's about time for us to take good care of our own interests. And the moment he did it, the process was underway with Israel. The same goes for the Jordanian, was the second country, but more importantly, it goes for the Palestinians. Because Yasser Arafat did go to Oslo not out of love for Israel. He never made clear to what extent he's going to give up his ultimate dream of one day having one big Palestine, as was the text of the Arab-Palestinian National Covenant, both the original version and the amended version of '68. He went there because he realized that he's lonely. That nobody is going to go beyond verbal solidarity with this struggle, and his people were so fatigued and so tired that especially after in the aftermath of the first Gulf War between the coalition and Iraq, he lost basically everything, and his people were kicked out of Kuwait and the Gulf states, and he was in a very dire, difficult situation. And for him was, hold a second, you know, my particular interest is probably as important, if not more important, than the Pan-Arabic. And so he briefly made a decision to go and explore the possibility of a diplomatic let's say, engagement with Israel. Now, we don't have today Pan-Arabism, but we have something, I would say, more energetic and more threatening. And this is Pan-Islamism. So there is a kind of a shift from referring to this conflict and conflict resolution in terms of a clash between national movements. National movements, you know, eventually are reasonable parties. They can sit down and negotiate. They can reach a compromise. When you inject religion into the equation and you shift from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Islamism, then the discussion becomes a heated one. The discussion becomes not very rational because there is no human being capable to compromise with what are the basic tenets of the faith. And this is exactly one of the reasons which I mentioned in my opening remarks. There's a lot of negative energy which is now sweeping across the entire region. And this poses a very significant problem, not only for the representative of the national current in the Palestinian movement, Mahmoud Abbas and Salem Fayyad, and the Fatah movement by and large. Okay, not everybody in the Fatah, but by and large. The Fatah movement, which was a typical national liberation movement, we talk in secular terms, and eventually accepted, actually openly accepted, the vision of a two-state solution. And this is not the case with the Islamists. The Islamists are talking about reconstituting the Ummah, but not in the national sense, but by setting up a caliphate and reviving an idea from the early glorious day of triumphant military Islam. And so they are engaged in a double revolution. A revolution against their own leaders who are compromising the basic interests by selling up to the West and being the slaves of the West and Zionists and others. And in parallel, strong resistance against whatever is associated with the West, cultural, political, diplomatic, including conflict resolution. And in this clash, which if you reduce the big frame to the small frame of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you come back to the Palestinians. It's a clash between Fatah, a movement which has been around, which apparently controls all the institutions of the Palestine Liberation Organization, because Hamas is not part of the PLO.